Nancy Pelosi thought she could walk into that room, wrap herself in decades of power, mock a Southern accent, dismiss a so-called country lawyer, and walk out untouched. But what she didn't realize was that John Kennedy had already decided this would be the day Washington's double standard stopped hiding behind polished language and perfect posture. Why did he come at her this hard, this fast, and this publicly? Why did the tone shift from polite disagreement to something far colder and more deliberate? If you want the answer, you have to stay with me to the end, because this didn't start as a clash of personalities. It started as a test of whether power still has to explain itself in America. From the first seconds, the contrast was intentional. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't rush his words, didn't perform outrage for the cameras. He let the silence work, because silence forces attention in a city addicted to noise. Pelosi came prepared for a debate about policy and experience. What she walked into was an audit of credibility. The room itself mattered. This wasn't a cable news studio built for theatrics, but a Senate hearing room designed to project authority and continuity. High ceilings, long sightlines, and the quiet pressure of history sitting in every corner. When Kennedy spoke, he wasn't talking like a man trying to win an argument. He spoke like someone laying the foundation for a case. Pelosi's opening posture was familiar to anyone who has watched Washington for decades. She framed the moment as beneath her, as unnecessary, as political theater dressed up as reform. She leaned on seniority, on experience, on the implication that longevity equals legitimacy. The subtext was clear. This institution belongs to people like her, and critics are guests who should mind their tone. That framing has worked for a long time. Kennedy didn't challenge her resume. He challenged the assumption that a resume exempts anyone from explanation. He leaned into the persona she thought she could use against him. The slow cadence, the regional phrasing, the deliberate pauses. Not as self-defense, but as misdirection. Because while Pelosi spoke about norms, Kennedy spoke about incentives. This is where the hook becomes more than a line. The shock wasn't that Kennedy criticized Pelosi. The shock was that he did it without emotion, without insult, and without urgency. That calm signaled preparation, not improvisation. Viewers could feel it even if they couldn't yet explain it. Kennedy framed the moment as simple curiosity, not accusation, not condemnation, just a desire to understand how rules operate differently depending on who is being governed. He asked why transparency always seems clearer in hindsight than in real time. Why disclosure often arrives after decisions, after profits, after consequences are already locked in. The questions were quiet, but they cut through the room. Pelosi responded by defending process. She spoke about systems, safeguards, and institutional balance. Her language was careful, practiced, and internally consistent, but it relied on one fragile assumption: that procedure automatically produces trust. Kennedy's posture suggested the opposite, that trust is produced by symmetry, not formality. At this point, the audience stopped waiting for fireworks. They started listening for direction. This wasn't about left versus right or red versus blue. It was about whether accountability flows upward or downward. That is a question every viewer understands instinctively. Kennedy hinted, without saying it outright, that power in Washington often behaves like gravity. It pulls consequences away from itself and pushes them onto everyone else. The more senior the figure, the softer the landing. The more ordinary the citizen, the harsher the impact. No chart was needed, because the pattern already felt familiar. A brief note of dry humor slipped in, almost unnoticed. Kennedy observed that Washington disclosures seemed designed for historians rather than voters. The line wasn't meant to entertain. It was meant to normalize skepticism without sounding angry. That subtlety mattered. Pelosi warned that this kind of framing risks undermining faith in institutions. She positioned herself as a guardian of stability, someone protecting democracy from reckless suspicion. It was a powerful move, one that has shut down many critics before. But this time, it landed differently. Because Kennedy wasn't attacking the institution, he was interrogating its behavior. He made it clear that skepticism doesn't destroy trust. Selective accountability does. People lose confidence not because they ask questions, but because those questions are answered with deflection instead of clarity. That idea lingered in the room longer than any single exchange. It reframed the confrontation as necessary rather than disruptive. By the end of this opening phase, the audience understood why the attack felt so sharp. It wasn't personal, and it wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. Kennedy wasn't trying to embarrass Pelosi. He was forcing a conversation that polite deference had delayed for years. And that is why the hook matters. Because once you see the confrontation through that lens, everything that follows stops looking like drama and starts looking like exposure. What comes next is not louder. It is more precise. And once precision takes over, there is no safe place left to hide behind experience alone. The second movement begins once the initial shock has done its job, because shock alone never sustains attention unless it leads somewhere uncomfortable. After the opening confrontation, the room does not erupt, it tightens, and that tightening is intentional. Kennedy understands that once people stop reacting emotionally, they start evaluating. And evaluation is far more dangerous to entrenched power than outrage. This is where the exchange stops being about tone and starts being about structure. The audience, both in the room and at home, senses that the conversation has crossed a threshold. Kennedy shifts away from Pelosi herself and toward the system that made her confidence possible. He speaks slowly about rules, not as abstract safeguards, but as mechanisms that shape behavior over time. Rules, he explains, do not just punish misconduct. They signal what is tolerated before misconduct ever happens. When signals are uneven, behavior adjusts accordingly. This framing quietly removes personality from the center of the debate. Pelosi responds by emphasizing experience, suggesting that institutional memory prevents reckless reform. Her argument is not illogical, and that is what makes it persuasive to some viewers. She frames longevity as a stabilizing force, something earned through decades of navigation and compromise. The underlying message is that institutions survive because of people like her. Kennedy lets that claim sit without immediate rebuttal. Instead of contradicting her directly, Kennedy reframes experience as influence. Experience, he argues, explains why someone understands the system, not why they should be shielded by it. The longer someone operates inside power, the more visible their incentives become. Visibility, in turn, demands transparency, not deference. This distinction subtly undercuts Pelosi's central defense. The audience begins to notice that Kennedy rarely accuses. He narrates patterns rather than motives. This is a deliberate choice because motives invite denial, while patterns invite recognition. Patterns do not need intent to exist. They only require repetition. Once repetition is established, denial sounds hollow. Pelosi leans on process, citing disclosures, committees, and internal oversight as proof that accountability already exists. Her tone is controlled, confident, and procedural. She presents the system as complete, if imperfect. The implication is that reform proposals exaggerate isolated issues. Kennedy does not dispute the existence of mechanisms, only their timing and effect. He introduces the idea that disclosure without immediacy is informational, not corrective. Information that arrives after decisions are made cannot change outcomes. It may satisfy record-keeping, but it does not empower voters or oversight in real time. Kennedy frames this as the difference between transparency as ritual and transparency as restraint. That line lands quietly but firmly. A small moment of dry humor punctuates the tension. Kennedy remarks that Washington disclosures often read like apologies written after the check has cleared. The line is understated, almost casual. It earns a restrained reaction, not laughter, but recognition. Humor here functions as confirmation, not distraction. Pelosi cautions against reducing complex governance to suspicion-driven narratives. She warns that such framing risks feeding cynicism and weakening public trust. Her concern is framed as protective, almost civic-minded. She positions herself as defending democracy from corrosive doubt. But the warning also implies that skepticism itself is irresponsible. Kennedy responds by redefining skepticism as a response, not a threat. People do not wake up distrusting institutions, he suggests. They learn it through observation. When rules appear flexible for some and rigid for others, trust erodes organically. It is not manufactured. It is earned in reverse. This reframing shifts responsibility away from the public and back toward governance. The conversation deepens as Kennedy discusses enforcement asymmetry. He describes how ordinary citizens experience rules as immediate and unforgiving. Deadlines are firm, penalties are real, and appeals are limited. In contrast, powerful figures often experience rules as negotiable. The disparity is never written down, but it is widely understood. Pelosi pushes back by highlighting the scrutiny that comes with public office. She describes the constant pressure, the media attention, the lack of privacy. Her point is that power extracts its own cost. This resonates with viewers who understand public life. But it does not address the core issue of consequence. Kennedy acknowledges scrutiny, then separates visibility from accountability. Being criticized, he argues, is not the same as being constrained. Noise can create the illusion of oversight while leaving incentives untouched. True accountability operates quietly, through predictable consequences. That distinction sharpens the debate. By this point, the audience has recalibrated its expectations. They are no longer waiting for a dramatic collapse or verbal knockout. They are watching a slow exposure of assumptions. The question is no longer whether reform is polite. It is whether reform is necessary. Kennedy subtly turns outward, addressing viewers rather than Pelosi. He frames the issue as one that affects anyone who has ever faced a rule enforced without explanation. He invites the audience to compare their own experiences with what they are hearing. This is not a call to anger, but to alignment. It pulls the debate out of Washington and into everyday life. Pelosi senses the shift and tightens her language. Her answers become shorter, more precise, less expansive. She understands that broad defenses are no longer landing. The exchange has moved beyond party lines. It now sits squarely in the territory of legitimacy. As this section closes, the atmosphere is no longer confrontational, but evaluative. The audience is weighing competing philosophies of power. One treats authority as stewardship constrained by scrutiny. The other treats authority as expertise deserving insulation. No verdict is declared yet, but the direction is unmistakable. What began as a sharp hook has evolved into a structural argument. The shock opened the door, but logic is now doing the work. Viewers are not being told what to think. They are being shown how to think about power. And once that shift occurs, the rest of the confrontation becomes unavoidable. The third movement begins when the conversation drifts from rules on paper to power in practice, because this is the point where abstractions finally meet lived reality. Up to now, the exchange has circled structure and principle, but Kennedy now narrows the frame to outcomes, to what actually happens when systems designed by elites are experienced by ordinary people. The tone does not sharpen, it steadies, and that steadiness signals confidence rather than escalation. This is where the argument stops asking what the rules say and starts asking who they protect. The audience can feel the shift even before it is articulated. Kennedy introduces the idea that power reveals itself most clearly, not in moments of crisis, but in moments of routine enforcement. He describes how everyday citizens encounter the state through forms, deadlines, penalties, and silence. There is no press conference when a filing error costs someone their savings. No national address when a small mistake compounds into a life-altering consequence. Those moments are quiet, and precisely because they are quiet, they rarely attract mercy. Pelosi responds by reiterating that governance cannot be personalized to individual hardship. She emphasizes scale, complexity, and the impossibility of tailoring systems to every circumstance. Her argument is logical, even necessary, for any functioning bureaucracy. Rules, she implies, must be general to be fair. But generality, Kennedy suggests, is not the same as neutrality. Kennedy draws a careful distinction between universality and symmetry. A rule can apply to everyone in theory, while affecting people very differently in practice. When resources, access, and time are unevenly distributed, enforcement magnifies inequality rather than correcting it. This is not a moral accusation, but a structural observation. He frames it as a design flaw rather than a personal failure. The audience begins to sense that this is no longer about Pelosi specifically. She has become a stand-in for a broader class of authority. Kennedy is careful not to personalize blame, because personalization would allow the system to escape scrutiny. If the problem is individual misconduct, replacing individuals solves it. If the problem is incentives, replacement changes nothing. Pelosi pushes back by emphasizing institutional continuity. She argues that stability requires experienced leadership, not constant disruption. Her language suggests that reformers underestimate the fragility of governance. This is not fear-mongering, but caution shaped by decades inside the system. Still, it assumes that stability and accountability are competing values. Kennedy challenges that assumption without dismissing experience. He argues that stability without correction eventually becomes rigidity. Systems that cannot adjust lose legitimacy even if they retain authority. Legitimacy, once eroded, is far harder to rebuild than it is to protect. This reframes reform as maintenance rather than rebellion. A subtle note of irony appears when Kennedy observes that Washington often treats public frustration as a messaging problem rather than a governance problem. The line is delivered without mockery, almost gently. It suggests that leaders focus on explaining outcomes instead of re-examining causes. The audience recognizes the pattern instantly. Explanation becomes a substitute for change. Pelosi warns that such framing risks empowering demagogues who exploit distrust. Her concern is real, grounded in recent history. She argues that weakening institutional confidence creates openings for extremism. This is one of her strongest points, and it lands with weight. But it also raises an uncomfortable question. Kennedy responds by asking whether ignoring legitimate distrust does more harm than confronting it. When people feel unheard, they do not become patient. They become alienated. Alienation is fertile ground for manipulation. In that sense, accountability is not a threat to democracy, but a safeguard. The argument reframes reform as preventative rather than reactive. The exchange grows quieter here, less rhetorical, more reflective. Kennedy speaks about perception, how citizens judge fairness not by speeches, but by patterns. If enforcement feels selective, explanations sound hollow, no matter how eloquent. People trust what they can predict. Inconsistency erodes that predictability. Pelosi acknowledges perception matters, but insists governance cannot be driven by optics. She warns against policymaking shaped by public mood rather than expertise. This is a classic tension between technocracy and democracy. Her position values informed decision-making over popular reaction. Kennedy's response reframes the dichotomy. He argues that expertise and accountability are not opposites. True expertise should welcome scrutiny, because scrutiny improves outcomes. Systems that fear examination often do so because examination threatens comfort, not competence. This line does not accuse, it invites reconsideration. It suggests that confidence and transparency should coexist. The audience now understands why Kennedy has remained so measured. Raising his voice would collapse the argument into spectacle. By staying calm, he forces attention onto substance. The confrontation feels less like a clash and more like a slow unveiling. Every response adds another layer of clarity. As this section progresses, viewers begin to see the deeper stakes. This is not about winning a debate or humiliating an opponent. It is about redefining what responsible power looks like in a system that rewards longevity. Kennedy is not asking whether leaders are smart or experienced. He is asking whether they are still constrained. Pelosi's posture reflects this realization. Her answers become more defensive, not in tone, but in scope. She narrows her claims, avoids broad generalizations. This is the response of someone who senses the ground shifting beneath familiar arguments. The exchange has moved beyond comfortable terrain. By the close of this movement, the audience is no longer watching a partisan dispute. They are watching a philosophical divide over authority itself. One vision treats power as something that accumulates legitimacy through time. The other treats power as something that must be continuously justified. That divide will define everything that follows. What began as a confrontation has now become an examination. The hook pulled viewers in with force. This phase holds them with recognition. They are not being entertained anymore. They are being implicated. The fourth movement begins when the discussion turns from philosophy to consequence, because this is where abstract disagreement finally collides with accountability. Up to this point, both sides have spoken about systems, legitimacy, and trust in broad terms, but now Kennedy subtly redirects the conversation toward responsibility, not as a moral slogan, but as an operational reality. His shift is careful, almost surgical, and it signals that the debate is entering its most uncomfortable phase. This is the moment when ideas stop floating and start demanding ownership. The room feels it immediately. Kennedy frames responsibility not as blame, but as proximity to power. The closer one is to decision-making authority, the greater the obligation to anticipate consequences. He argues that leadership is not defined by how often one is right, but by how often one is answerable. Longevity in office, in this framing, does not automatically confer wisdom. It increases the duty to self-examine. Pelosi responds by emphasizing collective decision-making. She notes that Congress acts through committees, votes, and negotiations, not unilateral will. This dispersal of authority, she suggests, makes individual accountability difficult to isolate. Responsibility, in her view, is shared and therefore diffuse. The argument is institutionally accurate, but Kennedy presses on its implications. He points out that diffusion of responsibility often functions as insulation rather than protection. When everyone is responsible, no one is accountable. Systems designed to prevent abuse can also prevent correction if they obscure agency. This is not framed as intentional evasion, but as structural drift. Over time, insulation becomes invisibility. The audience begins to sense a deeper critique forming. Kennedy is no longer questioning Pelosi's intentions or competence. He is questioning whether the architecture of power itself has evolved to shield those at the top from consequence. This is a harder charge to refute because it does not rely on motive. It relies on pattern. Pelosi counters by invoking historical achievements. She references landmark legislation, coalitions built, crises navigated. Experience, she argues, produces results that justify authority. The implication is that success retroactively validates the structure that enabled it. Kennedy does not dispute the achievements, but reframes their relevance. He argues that past success does not guarantee present integrity. Institutions must be judged continuously, not ceremonially. A system that once functioned well can degrade without deliberate correction. Celebrating history cannot substitute for auditing the present. This distinction lands with quiet force. At this point, Kennedy introduces the concept of asymmetry in consequence. He describes how mistakes made by ordinary citizens carry immediate penalties. Miss a filing deadline? Pay a fine. Violate a rule unknowingly? Face enforcement. But mistakes made by powerful actors often result in explanations, reviews, or quiet revisions. This is not presented as outrage, but as imbalance. Kennedy speaks about how asymmetry erodes public faith faster than ideology ever could. People accept rules when they believe those rules apply upward as well as downward. When enforcement appears selective, trust collapses. No messaging strategy can repair that. Pelosi acknowledges the perception problem, but resists the implication that leaders are exempt. She points to oversight mechanisms, ethics committees, internal reviews. Her argument is that accountability exists, even if it is less visible. Kennedy's response is measured but decisive. Visibility, he argues, is not a cosmetic feature of accountability. It is its foundation. Accountability that cannot be seen does not function socially. It may exist procedurally, but it fails psychologically. Citizens cannot trust what they cannot observe. Transparency is not theater, it is verification. Without it, enforcement feels arbitrary. The exchange tightens here, not emotionally, but intellectually. Kennedy presses the idea that opacity benefits incumbency. Those who know the system best also know how to navigate its blind spots. This is not corruption in the cinematic sense. It is optimization within unexamined rules. Pelosi responds by warning against cynicism. She argues that assuming bad faith where complexity exists risks delegitimizing governance altogether. Her concern is that relentless suspicion can become corrosive. Kennedy concedes the danger, but redirects the conclusion. Cynicism grows not from scrutiny, but from secrecy. This is one of the most resonant moments for the audience. The argument feels less like a debate and more like a diagnosis. Kennedy is not accusing leaders of malice. He is accusing systems of drift, and drift, left uncorrected, becomes decay. He illustrates this by discussing incentives. Systems reward behavior. They do not explicitly forbid. If longevity yields influence without increased oversight, influence compounds unchecked. Over time, leaders stop feeling monitored and start feeling indispensable. That psychological shift changes decision-making even without conscious intent. Pelosi pushes back by emphasizing the burden of leadership. She speaks of constant pressure, public scrutiny, and the impossibility of pleasing everyone. This is not a performance. It is a lived reality. Kennedy does not dismiss it. Instead, he reframes burden as precisely why constraints matter. Power under pressure requires guardrails, not exemptions. The more difficult the role, the more essential the limits. Without them, stress rationalizes shortcuts, and shortcuts normalize exception. Accountability, in this framing, protects leaders from themselves as much as it protects the public. This turns the argument on its head. The room grows noticeably quieter as this point lands. It is difficult to reject without rejecting the premise of self-restraint. Pelosi's responses become more cautious, more qualified. She speaks of balance, of avoiding extremes. Kennedy agrees, but defines balance differently. Balance, he argues, is not achieved by splitting the difference between power and restraint. It is achieved by aligning authority with consequence. When decision-makers feel the weight of their choices, systems behave better. When they do not, systems drift toward self-preservation. This is not ideology. It is institutional physics. As this section closes, the audience realizes something important. The debate is no longer about any single bill, policy, or individual. It is about whether power in modern governance still experiences friction. Kennedy is arguing that friction has been engineered out. Pelosi is defending the structure that removed it. The tension now is no longer partisan. It is structural. And once structural questions are raised, they cannot be unasked. The audience remains engaged, not because of spectacle, but because recognition has set in. They have seen this pattern before, even if they could not name it. This movement ends not with a crescendo, but with a pause. A pause heavy enough to signal that the next phase will move from analysis to implication, from why the system behaves this way to what must happen if it continues. The hook brought them in. Now the consequences are unavoidable. The fifth movement begins when the conversation shifts from systems to stakes. Because once accountability is framed as structural, the unavoidable question becomes, what happens if nothing changes? This is where the debate stops being theoretical and starts to feel predictive. Kennedy does not threaten outcomes. He outlines trajectories. He speaks the way someone does when they have watched the same pattern repeat long enough to recognize the ending before it arrives. The tone is calm, but the implication is unmistakable. He argues that erosion rarely announces itself with sirens. Institutions do not collapse in a single vote or a dramatic scandal. They thin out slowly, hollowed by exceptions that were once justified as necessary. Each exception feels reasonable on its own, especially to those who benefit from it. Taken together, they produce a system that no longer corrects itself. Pelosi responds by warning against fatalism. She insists that democratic institutions have survived worse moments than this. History, she notes, is full of crises that seemed existential at the time, but proved temporary. Her argument is that resilience is built into the American system. Kennedy accepts the premise, but challenges the conclusion. Resilience, he says, is not automatic. It is the product of maintenance. Systems survive not because they are indestructible, but because people intervene before decay becomes irreversible. Ignoring early signs of imbalance is not confidence, it is neglect. The difference between durability and denial is action. He then turns to the psychological effect on the public, which is where the argument sharpens. Citizens, he explains, do not disengage because they dislike politics. They disengage because they believe outcomes are predetermined. When people conclude that power circulates within a closed loop, participation feels symbolic at best. That belief is corrosive in ways no single policy failure can match. Pelosi pushes back by emphasizing voter turnout, activism, and civic engagement. She points to movements, protests, and elections as evidence that the public still believes change is possible. Kennedy does not deny the energy. He questions its sustainability. Energy without feedback becomes exhaustion. He explains that engagement thrives when people see cause and effect. When action leads to observable correction, participation reinforces itself. When action leads only to explanation, justification, or delay, people adapt by withdrawing. They do not revolt, they resign. Resignation is quieter, but more dangerous. At this point, Kennedy introduces a subtle but powerful distinction between legality and legitimacy. Legality, he argues, is compliance with written rules. Legitimacy is belief that those rules are fair and evenly applied. A system can remain legal long after it has lost legitimacy. When that happens, enforcement becomes coercive rather than consensual. Pelosi acknowledges the distinction but resists the framing. She argues that legitimacy is subjective and easily manipulated. Populist narratives, she warns, can undermine trust even when systems function properly. Kennedy agrees that rhetoric matters, but insists that narratives only gain traction when reality supplies the fuel. People do not abandon trust without reason. He then addresses the role of leadership culture, which becomes a turning point in the exchange. Kennedy suggests that over time, leadership environments develop internal norms that differ from public expectations. What feels exceptional to citizens feels routine to insiders. Perks normalize. Access becomes invisible. Boundaries blur without anyone consciously crossing them. Pelosi responds by defending professionalism. She argues that experience produces competence, and competence requires continuity. Disrupting leadership too frequently, she warns, risks empowering amateurs. Kennedy reframes the concern. The problem, he says, is not experience. It is insulation. He argues that insulation changes behavior even among well-intentioned people. When consequences feel distant, decision-making shifts subtly. Short-term optics replace long-term trust. Process becomes a shield rather than a tool. The system stops learning because feedback no longer penetrates. The audience begins to sense the weight of this argument because it does not accuse individuals of corruption. It accuses environments of distortion. That makes it harder to dismiss as partisan. It also makes it harder to fix with messaging alone. Structural problems demand structural responses. Pelosi attempts to ground the conversation by returning to pragmatism. She asks how far reform should go without destabilizing governance. She frames reform as a balancing act between idealism and functionality. Kennedy answers by redefining pragmatism itself. True pragmatism, he says, is preventing future crises, not managing them after they erupt. He points out that most reforms are reactive. They follow scandal, outrage, or collapse. By then, trust is already damaged. Preventive reform feels unnecessary until it becomes indispensable. Leadership, he argues, is acting before necessity becomes emergency. The discussion then touches on generational consequences. Kennedy notes that younger citizens are watching how accountability functions now. They will inherit not just laws, but expectations. If they learn that rules flex upward, they will either seek power to benefit from that flexibility or disengage entirely. Neither outcome strengthens democracy. Pelosi responds with a caution about unintended consequences. She warns that reforms aimed at one problem can create others. Kennedy accepts the risk, but insists that paralysis is also a choice. Choosing not to act preserves existing incentives. Inaction is not neutral. As the exchange continues, humor slips in almost accidentally. Kennedy jokes that Washington has mastered the art of explaining why nothing can ever change. Pelosi counters that some explanations are simply reality. The moment draws quiet laughter, not because it is cutting, but because it is familiar. Recognition, not ridicule, fuels the reaction. The debate now feels less adversarial and more diagnostic. Both acknowledge complexity, both acknowledge risk. The difference lies in urgency. Kennedy treats drift as an active threat. Pelosi treats it as a manageable condition. This section closes with Kennedy posing a question rather than making a claim. He asks how many exceptions a system can absorb before it stops functioning as intended. He does not answer it. He lets the silence do the work. The audience feels the weight of the question because it mirrors their own unease. By now, it is clear that the argument is no longer about personalities. It is about whether governance can self-correct without external shock. Kennedy is betting that it cannot. Pelosi is betting that it will. The tension between those bets drives the final movement. As this phase ends, the atmosphere is charged but restrained. No one is shouting. No one is storming out. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The audience understands that the next step is not debate, but decision. What happens next will not be decided by who sounds sharper or more experienced. It will be decided by whether accountability is treated as a principle or a procedure. And that distinction, once made, does not fade. The final movement does not begin with a verdict, because verdicts belong to courts, not to moments like this. It begins with recognition, the quiet understanding that something has been said which cannot be unsaid. By now, the audience is no longer choosing sides based on tone or loyalty. They are weighing frameworks. They are asking which interpretation of power feels closer to their lived experience. Kennedy closes his case without triumph. There is no victory lap, no rhetorical flourish designed to dominate headlines. Instead, he returns to first principles, the kind politicians often invoke but rarely inhabit. He speaks about trust not as a slogan, but as a currency. Once spent irresponsibly, it takes generations to restore. He explains that accountability is not punishment. It is alignment. It aligns incentives with outcomes, authority with responsibility, power with restraint. When alignment disappears, even good intentions produce harmful results. Systems drift not because people are evil, but because unchecked incentives always drift towards self-preservation. Pelosi listens closely now, less defensive than earlier, though still guarded. She does not concede the argument, but she no longer dismisses it. Her response reframes the issue as one of institutional continuity. She warns that relentless skepticism can weaken cohesion. Kennedy accepts the concern, but draws a sharper distinction. Cohesion without credibility, he argues, is fragile. It depends on compliance rather than consent. Consent is earned through consistency, not speeches. When people believe the rules apply differently at different altitudes, cohesion becomes performative. It holds until it doesn't. The conversation then turns outward, beyond the chamber, beyond the personalities involved. Kennedy speaks directly to viewers without theatrics. He acknowledges that most Americans do not expect perfection from their leaders. They expect symmetry. They expect that privilege does not exempt responsibility. Pelosi counters with a reminder that governing is inherently asymmetrical. Experience matters. Expertise matters. Kennedy agrees, but insists that exemption is not the same as expertise. One justifies influence, the other erodes trust. There is a moment of near silence, the kind that only happens when both sides understand the gravity of what is being discussed. No one interrupts. No staffer whispers. The room feels smaller, not because of tension, but because of focus. This is the point where viewers decide whether they are watching a performance or a reckoning. Kennedy introduces a final, deceptively simple question. If accountability measures are unnecessary, why do they provoke such resistance? If transparency is harmless, why fear it? If leadership is truly honorable, why insulate it from scrutiny? He lets each question land without commentary. Pelosi responds carefully, choosing words that acknowledge concern without surrendering ground. She warns against absolutism. Kennedy replies that accountability is not absolute. It is foundational. It is the floor, not the ceiling. Everything else is built on top of it. Humor returns briefly, almost as a release valve. Kennedy remarks that Washington has perfected the art of promising reform while explaining why reform is impossible. Pelosi allows a faint smile, conceding the familiarity of the critique without endorsing it. The audience laughs softly, not at anyone, but at the shared recognition. As the exchange winds down, the tone shifts from confrontation to consequence. Kennedy makes clear that this debate is not about winning today's argument. It is about what kind of system survives tomorrow. Pelosi emphasizes stewardship and gradualism. Kennedy emphasizes correction before collapse. The final lines are not accusatory. They are cautionary. Kennedy reminds the audience that democracies rarely fail loudly. They fail through accumulated exemptions, normalized exceptions, and deferred accountability. By the time collapse is visible, repair is no longer an option. He ends by returning responsibility to the public, not as a burden, but as an inheritance. Citizens, he says, decide what behavior is tolerated by what they excuse. Silence is not neutrality, it is permission. The system reflects what its people are willing to overlook. Pelosi offers a closing reflection of her own. She speaks of legacy, not personal, but institutional. She urges caution, deliberation, and faith in continuity. Kennedy does not contradict her. He simply adds that continuity without correction is stagnation. The debate ends without applause. Not because it failed, but because it landed. Viewers are not told what to think. They are asked what they are willing to accept. That question lingers longer than any soundbite. And that is where the story resolves. Not with a winner declared, but with a choice exposed. Between comfort and correction. Between explanation and accountability. Between watching power operate and deciding how it should be constrained. If the opening asked why one figure would dare to confront another so directly, the ending provides the answer without spelling it out. Because moments like this are not about individuals. They are about whether the rules still mean what people believe they mean, and whether anyone is willing to ask that question out loud.